brought to you by MetaJuice.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm glad you mentioned introvert and extrovert because I consider myself an introvert, even though I have an extrovert kind of persona that I put on. And I find things like oversharing on social media or all this kind of stuff really uncomfortable and unnatural for me. And I think there's an opportunity for technology either to like help people who are introverted to get over those kind of barriers that we might feel, or also to reinforce that. And I'm wondering if you just have any more insight around that introvert extrovert kind of area of design.
I think we hear the term, bringing your whole self to work, right? And that was big for a while. And people are like, and now we're get to the oversharing piece of it. We're like, oh, here's all my life. We're like, well, okay, we need to take that with kind of a little bit of a grain of salt, right? What we mean is we want you to bring to work yourself as much as you are comfortable with sharing, or that you want to share, or that you feel is important for other people to know and how they communicate and connect to you. That's it. Like if you don't want to talk about your family, don't talk about your family, but if you're like, I am all about dogs, and if I see your dog running by on the video, I'm going to stop and we're going to have a conversation because we're going to connect on that thing, right? And so it because our introverts, we saw them getting scared. They're like, I don't want to have to say all of those things, right? You're like, okay, bringing your whole self to work means having the opportunity for you to determine that scale and let you be the driver of that information. And a lot of the equity inclusion work we do, it's important for us to get certain personal characteristics information, right? So if we're trying to figure out, are more women leaving the organization than men? This is a great question to have. But in order to do that, we have to know, how people are defined by their gender. So we have to ask that question, right? And so there's this line of how much information do we really need, and what are we using that for, right? Are we using, information is like any tool or power, could be used for good or evil, right? And so in order to get your employees and your peers to share that information, you have to be real clear about what you're intending to use that for, right? And so the more benefit you can demonstrate to individuals and to introverts, and like, hey, if you help me understand this piece about you, then I can provide the right kind of resources to you. I can find you a sponsor or a mentor that's going to be better matched to you. Or if you're more of a visual learner, I'm going to send you this pitch deck. If you're more of an audio learner, listen to this podcast. So having that information helps us help each other do our jobs better and connect. But there's that fine line in there between how much am I going to share, and what are we using it for? And so being able to sort of really think strategically through that, like, what are we asking? What are we asking of our introverts? What are we trying to do? One of the things we talked about in our Zoom meetings and equity and inclusion is we want to make sure all the voices are heard. So we've got all the people in the room that need to be there, but they're like, well, Dionn's always in the meeting, but she never speaks up. So what's the point of having her at the table if she's not going to say anything, right? And so I'm like, well, what if I'm really introverted and not great at like speaking in front of a 30-person Zoom thing? They're like, okay, perhaps it would be better if she was able to record something previously or write a document that we share and talk through. What are the other ways that we can engage that person, their knowledge, their skills, their expertise in a way that's comfortable and will help them be even more successful? Because what we can't do is demand that everybody needs to be an extrovert. We want you on the camera and like super engaging. And like, that's just not everyone's jam. It just isn't it, right? And so we shouldn't expect that from everybody. But really understanding like what we know about you, what you care to share about yourself helps us sort of manage that on the other side.
Thank you for that. That's really refreshing to hear. In a world where everybody needs to be on TikTok and all this kind of stuff, it's great to have that reinforced that we're not all like that. And yeah, so I appreciate that. Thank you. So I have kind of a big question for you. So today in 2022, only 63% of the world has regular access to the internet, which I think is really easy to forget sometimes. And I can see potential for techno inequality to become even greater as the first world starts to adopt Metaverse and XR technologies. What are your thoughts on this? And also, where do you think that responsibility around inclusion lies?
Yes. Well, we saw this play out not too long ago in a big form when the pandemic hit and all the kids went to virtual schooling. All of a sudden, there is a large portion of our school kids who don't have reliable access to the internet. So how can they be on this Zoom meeting? They don't have a printer at home where they can print off the worksheets that they're supposed to be working on.
Right.
And it was, I mean, there's nothing great about the pandemic, but it was a very important piece that came out of that was like, okay, digital accessibility, internet accessibility is an equity issue that we have to handle from the jump, from the get-go, from these kids, right? And so we had school districts who were like, okay, we are buying and we're distributing computers or tablets to every kid. They're delivering hotspots for internet because we had kids, parents parking in the Starbucks parking lot, so that they could do their classwork, things like that. And we had some school districts who had school buses with hotspots who would drive to a particular area.
Wow.
And so that they were broadcasting, things like that. So we got real, here's the thing is we can be really innovative when pressed. This world has a lot of very smart people. And when we focus in on a particular thing, we will find solutions. And so I was really proud of the way sort of everybody sort of rallied around and got this. But it just sort of highlights your point is that, yes, there are these digital inequities. And so as we move, who are we leaving behind in this process? And I'm a big fan of social programs and sort of providing these kinds of resources because in, most cases, especially when you think about the kids, in most cases for the kids, this is no fault of their own, that this is the situation that they are living in. And so are we stacking the generational decisions on folks who have no ability to change any of that or to do anything about that? And then that's when we get this generational cycle that's super hard to break. So we have to come in with a hard effort and hard change to really break that generational cycle. And the great thing about doing that is we're actually helping two generations at the same time. So when we deliver internet to these areas that didn't have it before, now we're giving access to both the adults that are living there as well as the kids who are living there. Maybe now they have access to online education that they didn't have before, right? They're like, I can't go to school or finish my GED or go to college because I'm working full time. But if you could take online courses at night in between shifts, now you're helping yourself, get into a different situation. So, so I think it's super important that we address this as a global program to make sure that it needs to be one of those necessities. You get water to the house, you get electricity to the house, you get internet to the house, or whatever facility you happen to be staying in, right? Because we had folks in shelters or different group homes who are like, now all of a sudden they did have internet, but now they have the entire home of everybody drawing down on the internet at the same time. Now everyone's right, because they can't get their video going. So really kind of looking at those kinds of places like, okay, well, these guys need a higher speed internet because they're going to have 50 people accessing at the same time. But I do think it's going to be it needs to be a basic necessity that we include in our general infrastructure of society.
Yes, I very much agree with that. One thing I wanted to ask you about is when it comes to speaking up around discrimination, I think often people don't because they find it can be really difficult or isolating or stigmatizing. Wondering if you think that technology can play a role in improving how cases are brought up, investigated, and dealt with.
I do. There are some, one of the nice things about having a technological intervention is that it takes a little bit of the person and the personality piece out of it. So there are okay, here's a great example. So you have Grammarly is a great software product, right? It's like checks your reading, you're like, oh, that was active tense, you might want to go something with, that was passive, you might want to active, you're like missing a comma, things like that. And then it starts to extend to the type of sentiment you're writing about, right? Like, oh, this week you wrote really strong and pervasive, kinds of things. And so then you have organizations like Fair Words who look at that content and can identify places where you are potentially gone afoul of like discriminatory languages or terms that just have historically been in our nomenclature, but now that we know better, we're trying to do better. We know that these are some of the words that we're not going to say anymore. Let's use a different word, right? We've gone from master bedroom to primary residence, things like that, that we're making these changes. And so you have technology and you have great AI now that can go through and do that, right? So imagine if you're sending out your corporate comms, you have something like Fair Words or something like that that goes through and it's like, oh, you might not want to say this term. Let's fix that. Then it's like, and you can also then provide, here's why, here's the educational piece on the background. Here's the kinds of folks that, it's discriminating against, or it's creating an issue. And here's some other options to choose from. Great. We've learned what the problem is. We understand why it's an issue. We have some solutions on how to change it and move forward. Great. So we've completed the whole cycle. And now we've updated and now we're moving forward. So I think technology we have a great opportunity to leverage that information, because any of the stuff that's coming digitally, we can look at that and do our analysis before it goes out the door, the revision. And so I think, and again, that takes it out of like your manager coming and saying, now, Dionn, you really shouldn't say, here's a great example. McKinsey just came out with their report on race, and they had someone had said something in there that, oh, they were no longer advancing beyond positions of bottom of the totem pole. And we're like, oh, that's really, but it's like, oh, if they had somebody else that just like had one more pass through that, maybe they would have checked that. And it's a report on race. You're like, oh, we missed it. So like, let's fix that. And here's the thing, we are all going to make mistakes. We're all learning every day we get, and this is part of the communication and the broadening of being exposed to a diverse universe, is that we're learning more and more information about different people's cultures, and then understanding our own history of how we've come to view that or interact with that and how we can make those changes. So look, we're all going to make mistakes. Let's be clear. Your job then is to be like, acknowledge, be like, yep, mess that up. I've done some learning. Here's how I'm going to change moving forward. And then also, to your point, holding other people accountable. So when you see something, it is still a part of your job to be like, hey, I noticed this, you might want to, and here's some resources, and then you sort of take them through the same kind of process as that. But when you overlay the technology piece in it, then you sort of remove the judgment or like the personality piece coming in there, and it makes it a little bit easier to sort of be like, oh yeah, I don't want to use that word. Just like a spell check. It's like you spelled something correctly. It's the same. You're like, oh, we're not using that phrase anymore. Okay, yep, nope, here's a synonym, or we're going to do this instead, and then keep it moving.
Yeah, I love that idea about the kind of removing how technology might be able to remove the judgment. I think us as people in the state of the internet and things that we are living in today, sometimes when people make a mistake, it can get them canceled immediately when, like you said, people are still learning, and we have to give people an opportunity to learn from their mistakes and to try again and to do better. And I hope that technology can help us in that respect.
Absolutely.
So one big kind of concept around technology that's getting all kinds of hype is when it comes to Web3. And part of the concept here is that, we have a centralized internet today where big tech companies basically decide what our internet looks like and how our data is being used and what privacy and security looks like. And this idea about Web3 is moving into a decentralized internet. But a big part of that is that we aren't going to have the same kind of oversight by big companies and governments. And while I see benefits in this, I also have a slight fear that things like separatist groups and hate groups could really have an opportunity to thrive in these spaces, and that potentially we could be looking at bringing the worst of our physical world into these virtual worlds. Is this something that is on your radar of things that we should be concerned about? And any ideas on how this could be potentially avoided or dealt with?
Absolutely. Like governance is such a huge topic around this, right? And, we're about to live through part of this experiment right now with the Twitter takeover, right? Because he's like, I'm all for free speech. It's gotta be, and we're like, okay, so are we going to go back to the age of like all this disinformation and, to your point, the hate groups, like finding one another? I mean, look, any tool can be used for good or evil, right? And so we're like, connections for good. You can also find connections that are out to not do such great things, right? And so how do we balance that? How do we balance the decentralization with the, good of the people, kind of a theory in there? I don't know what the answer is, right? And you'd like to believe as humans, we're deep down, we're all good people. But obviously we're not, and what, okay, so here's the interesting things I learned about. So I'm also take some writing courses in novel, and I have later aspirations when I retire to be an author. And we were talking about villains and writing about villains. And the thing about villains is they are not always, sometimes, but not always bad people. Sometimes they are just people who are, they wholeheartedly believe in this thing and are putting everything they believe behind it. Everything that they do, their entire actions, everything, and they are just completely in. Now, the thing that they believe in might not be great, right? But they are super committed, and that's why they're sort of super villainous. But when you start to unlayer the things and you're like, how did this person come to that particular belief? What unpacked that? And you start to look at the initial traumas that they endured, or what at some point they were bullied by this kind of a person, so now their whole goal is to decimate this entire population, sort of to unpack those things. So it's one of those things where in my most empathetic of moments, I like to believe that even when we encounter those kinds of folks in virtual spaces, that it provides an opportunity to have some conversations and to start unpacking those positions and those things, and really getting to the meat of why are we having this issue? Why do you believe that? Because a lot of times it's based on, erroneous facts, something they heard from somebody else, their life experience. This is what my parents did, and this is what my parents told me, so this is what I believe. We're like, well, how did they figure it out? Like, or is that true? So I'm part of me is that, okay, when it comes up, these all become learning opportunities for us. But that sort of relies on the graciousness of everybody willing to sort of discuss in some sort of logical, sort of way. But back to your point, I don't, it is definitely a concern. You have to have some kind of governance in place. And as people, we know how to build cultures. We know how to build societies. You put, a group of people out in the woods together, they still come up with some kind of, okay, you're going to do this part of the job. You're going to do that. This is how this is organized. It all just sort of, I think it's in our, nature as humans, as people, is to find the structure that sort of, works and balances for folks as a group, right? And so if you get people getting squirrely, you have the rest of the organization that sort of comes down like, no, that's not really matching what our norms are sort of going to be. But it's going to be real interesting, right? And you have the problem with people being predatory in those spaces, right? Because as an avatar, you can be like, oh yes, I'm a kid too. Right? We have this gaming issue. I have two boys who do a lot of gaming, and we talk a lot about cyber safety. I mean, like, you don't know who that person is. You can't tell them where you live just because they say they're 16-year-old at this high school. No way to validate that, right? So you have to be real careful about those norms, because we've seen how those could be very negatively impactful and dangerous, quite frankly.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't have a good answer, but only that we have to be cognizant about it, and we have to be diligent about sort of keeping our eyes wide open as it develops and it evolves, and sort of trying to, figure out like what's the balance there. What kind of structures do we put in place? What kind of, rules, society rules do we embrace to keep all the positive things that you can get without sort of the danger, of those bottom elements.
I have hope that potentially when it comes to the example that you used about verifying how old someone is or if they're a predator, that potentially I think that could be a good use case for blockchain to be able to validate who somebody is through this technology. So older people can't get away with trying to be younger people, and younger people can't get away with trying to be older people and stuff. Which also brings up its own ethical issues, but but we will see where this one all goes. And it kind of actually leads me into this question, which is around one trend that I've been noticing is I'm seeing things like in different splintered metaverses. So for instance, like a metaverse for the LGBTQ plus community, a metaverse for a kids community, a metaverse for a specific creative group. Do you think that this is a fad, these different kind of metaverses, and that they'll kind of go away when we have a central metaverse? Or do you think this is something we're going to start to see more of?
The in real life example that's matches close to that are like employee resource groups, right? And because folks are looking for safe places where they can connect, communicate, share with other folks who have are experiencing the same kinds of challenges they are for whatever different segment that's going on. They're looking for support, right? And so they don't necessarily want other people who don't share those same experiences in those safe places. So when we think about creating these ERGs in our businesses, we're like, okay, here's the Black Women in Tech group, and we get together and we're like, oh, I got passed over for another job. Somebody's talking over me at work. You're like, yes, it sucks. Oh, I hate it, and sort of doing that. And so the first evolutions of those are these, like, it's a support group, right? The next evolution of those are, okay, these are the challenges that we are embracing, that we are experiencing. What are some possible solutions? What do we need from our organizations, or what do we need from society to overcome these barriers or to remove these barriers from us? And what are those possible solutions? And so then going from the internal echo chamber to saying, okay, these are the top 3 things we're going to go after this year, and we're going to start talking we're going to align our allies and get them all on board with doing this thing. So now we're doing this outreach piece. So it could be that there's these, the individual metaverses, while they gather, and, there's safety in numbers, and, sort of gathering our strength, and even someplace just finding comfort, right, in the crap that's going on in their lives, right? I need a place to vent. I just need a place to vent, and then I'm going to be fine, right? And so having that to then saying, okay, what should we do about it? Or what do we need done about it? Or what system do we need to have removed so that we're not experiencing this barrier anymore? And then going out and sort of being more proactive and sort of taking it to the streets, as it were. And so maybe they start out as separate nodes, and then they're like, oh, okay, now we're ready to sort of, cross-pollinate and things like that, or even start to look towards other, individual metaverses who we thought maybe we were different. But when we looked at our top 3 issues, guess what? They're the same, right? And so maybe we should join forces, and now we have a bigger number, and we have a bigger influence that we can go, and do some things. There's a great example of an organization who had a Black ERG, and then they also had a veterans ERG, and they had selected at one particular quarter, their top issue was homelessness, because that was one of the biggest drivers. And they were both like, wait, this is both a challenge for us. We're like, great. So they got together and did a Habitat for Humanity Day, did all this education around homelessness and how it affects the different groups, and gained much more traction and got more support from the organization as a whole, because they realized how, big of an impact this was having across, a lot of their organizations. So, being able to do that work internally and then sort of being able to lift the eyes, out of the group and sort of look around and be like, hey, who else is here? Who else might be able to help us? What do we need from one another? So I would imagine that we're going to see that same kind of evolution there.
That's great to hear. And so for my final question, what is your biggest fear around the future of inclusivity in the metaverse? And then what is your biggest hope?
My biggest fear, yes, is that we simply slide in real life into the metaverse. Like we bring the same structure, we bring the same rules, we bring the same barriers over, and it's built by and for a particular group of folks. That is my biggest fear. My biggest hope is that kids today are really smart. They're entering this field at a rapid pace. We've even removed the restrictions of, you don't even need a 4-year degree to go start, doing this stuff, right? You just need these technical skills and you can start in, right? So we're actually reducing the barriers to entry to get in. So that's going to open that up for a lot of more folks to be able to sort of participate in this way. And so I'm hopeful that this influx of this next generation of folks who are not saddled with some of the old ways of doing things, even their attitude as they approach is different, right? They're like, oh, we'll figure it out. Let's go in and that may have been what used to happen, but here's what we're going to do now, right? They're going to bring that level of energy and innovation and inclusivity into the space, not only as they participate, but into the design, into solutions, into all the supplementary things that are going to go around building the universe and maintaining the universe. And so I'm hopeful that influx is going to be the largest lever in sort of determining how the metaverse becomes.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And if people want to get in contact with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yes, you can find me on LinkedIn, Dionn.Schaffner. It's DIONN.SCHAFFNER. That's a great place. I maintain a big presence there. And then I'm also on the Aurea software website as well, if you want to connect with me there.
Thank you so much, Dionn. And thank you all so much for tuning in and watching. Stay tuned for next episodes, which will be covering Token 2049 London. See you soon. Take care.